It's that time of the year again. There's barely any tennis left to watch and there's no more rackets coming out, but at least today we get to have some fun and talk about the 5 best rackets that came out this year. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. So I had initially planned on making part 2 of my racket switch journey right after part 1, but that decision is proving quite difficult right now. I really don't want to rush it, so I'm going to take a break from that for a week, focus on playing with those 4 rackets as much as possible so that next week I can hopefully have a definitive answer. Should be a fun video. But yes, today it's our annual top 5 rackets of the year video, which is one of my favorite videos to make every year because it gives me a chance to reflect on all the great tech, designs, all the stuff that made reviewing so fun. Now before I get into any of it, I do just want to remind you that any of the rackets I talk about here today you can check out on our website racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. So as usual, I do just want to set out a bit of criteria here because I know this can get controversial, especially if your racket isn't on this list. So I just want to explain how I actually come up with these rankings. Well, really, that's exactly it, how I come up with these rankings. A lot of this is my own personal opinion. I do try to be as objective as possible, but especially when you're ranking the best for something, well, that's very subjective. No racket is really the best for anything. The best for me might not be the best for you, so please don't take this as a fact by any stretch of the imagination. Look at this more as a representation of what I consider good in a racket. Now, one of the things I wanted to focus on this year with this particular list is rackets that brought something new to the table in terms of originality and innovation. I'm not saying that brands have to reinvent the wheel every time they make a new racket, but it is nice when they come up with something new or at least make some major changes to a line rather than just copy pasting, which does happen pretty often. So yeah, something that makes me think, wow, this is super cool. That's going to help to push a racket pretty high up on this list. The other very important criteria, most of you know this by now, but we have to carry these rackets at the store. And no, we still don't carry the Pure Strike 100. I can't count the amount of comments that I get regarding that racket. I do appreciate the suggestion. I do think it is a racket that I would really like. Maybe if I can convince the powers that be at Rackets and Runners to bring it in, I can finally review it. But anyways, the next bit of criteria is that I'm only going to include rackets that came out in 2025, or at least are labeled 2025. For example, the new Ezones did technically come out in December of last year, but those would be eligible. And finally, I'm not going to repeat rackets that have the same mold. So for example, the Blade 98, 1619, and 1820 couldn't both be on this list because other than the string pattern, they are essentially the same racket. Well, that does mean they're not essentially the same racket, but they're not different enough for me to include them twice. And no, the Blade is not eligible because it came out last year, but that's just an example. Hopefully that all makes sense. I'm very excited for this video. I'm obviously going to list out all these rackets, but I'll also talk a little bit about them, tell you what you should expect and why I consider them so good. So without further ado, let's get into number 5. All right, so coming in at number 5, we have the Babolat Pure Drive 100. We finally got a new Pure Drive this year. I think the previous one came out in 2021, so it was a really long wait, but this did not disappoint. Now, part of the reason it didn't disappoint, and this is also why it's only coming in at number 5 and not any higher, but that's because Babolat didn't really change it all that much. They softened it up a tiny bit, about 2 RA points, and just generally made it a bit more dampened and more comfortable. But other than that, everything else remained the same. It has the exact same mold, string pattern, and density as the previous one. And like I said, that's something I might knock other rackets for, but not this one. This is the definition of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It actually hasn't really changed a lot since they first introduced it back in the early 2000s, but it works so well for so many people that I think it would actually be a mistake to change it too much. Some designs are just timeless in any industry, and this is the best example of that in tennis. Now, I actually hadn't played with the Pure Drive all that much before this year. I'd always preferred more control-oriented rackets, and then when I started doing reviews, it had already been out for a couple of years, so I didn't talk about it a lot. But I played with this new one a ton for the review, and I meshed with it so well that I ended up bringing it out to pretty much every session to compare with similar frames. And at this point, I'm actually considering switching to it. It's just such a solid racket. It's obviously the most iconic power racket of all time. It's forgiving, it's got that easy depth you want, and also a ton of top-end power, but it's so much more consistent than other power rackets. That's what makes it work so well for such a wide variety of players. Beginners, intermediates, power-oriented players, big spin players, and even more controlled players who want some extra pop on their ball can use it because it's so confidence inducing. I also have to say, the changes they made were subtle, but they're exactly what the Pure Drive needed if it did have to change. This is definitely more comfortable than the previous one, and that's a good thing because it is an inherently stiff design and it has caused some discomfort to certain players before. I wouldn't go as far as to say it's a comfortable racket now, but it is more comfortable, and that just makes it more accessible than it already was. Some purists may disagree with it going in this direction and say that more dampening means it's less crisp and has less pure ball feel, but I really don't think the dampening is over the top here. You definitely feel it, but it's not like an Ezone 100 or an Ultra 100. Those power rackets have taken that a little too far in my opinion. The Pure Drive still very much feels like a poppy and responsive power frame, but it's a little more refined, and that's the perfect way of updating it nowadays without alienating long-term users. Now, if Babolat ever wanted to take a bigger leap with it, there are certain things that could improve, I guess you could say. Sometimes this racket feels a little bit dated in the way that it swings through the air and the way it spins the ball, but that's being super nitpicky. Keep in mind, I play with almost every single racket out there, and I'm hyper analytical about everything. And no, it doesn't have the aerodynamics or spin potential of an Ezone 100, but it's not bad by any stretch of the imagination. But that is something they could try in the future. I wouldn't be mad at that as long as they didn't ruin the magic of the Pure Drive. But also, if they never want to change this racket at all, I have no issues with that either. It is pretty much the perfect racket. All right, so coming in at number 4, I did really hesitate as to whether I wanted to include this racket this year or not, but one thing did push me to do it, which I'll talk about in a second. It's the Head Gravity Pro, and unfortunately I don't have it with me today. Now, you all know how much I love the Gravity Pro. I think it's probably the best new-ish design of the last 6 years. I say new-ish because it is basically just a remake of the original Speed Pro, but this is just a phenomenal take on a modern control racket. The best thing about the Gravity Pro is just how solid and consistent it is. It has a high static weight, an 18x20 string pattern, and this teardrop 100 square inch head shape makes it so incredibly stable. It's the type of racket you can just wail at the ball and it's never going to surprise you, and the same goes for hitting softer, methodical control shots, and that's exactly what you want in a control racket. It also has that super soft and thin 20mm beam. A beam this thin is becoming less and less common nowadays just because it is so flexy that it doesn't give you a ton of free power and spin, but what it does give you is some of the cleanest, most connected feel for the ball. Every time you make contact, you feel everything that's going on in the string bed. The ball sinks in and you can grab and place it anywhere you want to put it. It's just such a beautiful sensation for purists and something that control-oriented players crave. What's so unique about the Gravity is that, unlike a Prestige or older thin beam control rackets that are starting to go extinct, is that because it has that teardrop head shape and the bigger 100 square inch head size, it doesn't actually lack that much power and spin. The bigger head opens up the string bed just enough to give you a bit more purchase over the ball without sacrificing consistency, and this has a lot of mass in the upper hoop and a slightly higher sweet spot, which gives you more leverage for power. Combining that power with this much control is really special, and it gives it that variety it needs to stay relevant in the modern game. Now, here's the thing with this Gravity Pro. We're on to the 3rd version of this racket now, and nothing about the mold or the design has really changed since the original 360 Plus. But this year, they actually did make a pretty important change to the weight specs and balance. The biggest criticism anyone had about the first 2 Gravities was that because of the combination of their teardrop head shape and really high swing weights, they were difficult to use and not very fast to accelerate through contact and move around the court with. Well, they lowered the balance from 315 to 310 millimeters, and they also dropped the swing weight to around 327 strum. More head light, lower swing weight. As you can imagine, it is a much quicker feeling racket, especially when you compare it to the original one, which was definitely a bit of a sledgehammer. It's much more user-friendly, and I think this is a great example of how brands can take an awesome design that has certain flaws and improve those without taking away from its core identity. I will say, I do think the Gravity plays best with a higher balance and mid 330 swing weight. That's how it was designed to play, and that's why super high level players love it that way. But that's not a slight on this version of the racket. If you can swing that, you can always customize it up to that spec. This just opens it up to more people. It's still 90% as good as its perfect spec, and I'd rather swing 90% of the Gravity Pro than 0% because I can't handle it. So great update, great racket, and while I won't be switching to it, I'm always gonna have it in my rotation for those days where I wanna feel some of the best pure traditional control. Now, coming in at number 3, we have the first racket on this list that's actually a new design, and that's pretty rare nowadays, but if you are gonna make a new design, do it like Head did with the Gravity Tour. The new Gravity Tour is a racket that Gravity fans had been asking Head to release for years, and credit to them, they listened to us and gave us exactly what we were asking for. Basically, the Gravity Tour takes the concept behind the 100 square inch gravities with their teardrop head shapes and concentrates it into a smaller 98 square inch 16 by 19, with the main goal being increasing maneuverability and precision. This is a much more maneuverable racket. That's the main issue with the bigger ones, is that no matter their spec, they're gonna feel a bit sluggish, and tightening up that head size eliminates most of those problems. And then in terms of precision, I don't think it's quite as deadly accurate as the Gravity Pro, but it is a significant step up from the Gravity MP and to a certain extent the old Gravity Tour. Now, what we weren't necessarily expecting from this racket was this uniquely powerful and fantastic booming sensation it makes when you hit the sweet spot. If you have had the chance to play with one of these, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But when you catch it right, the ball rockets off the strings and it makes a really loud sound that lets you know you made good contact. It's a very pleasant and unique hitting experience that when I was testing it, I really appreciated, and then I kind of missed it when I moved on to other rackets. The one little criticism I have with this racket, and honestly this is where my own personal opinion comes in, so take this with a grain of salt, not everyone feels this way, but this is why I have it coming in at number 3 and not number 1. I don't think this racket captures the gravity magic as well as maybe it could have, or at least what I was hoping for. What sets the Gravities apart, especially the 1820s, is their insane consistency and stability. It's not that this racket isn't consistent and stable, but it definitely isn't on the same level as those. I have a similar issue with the MP, so I think it might be that combination of a 22mm beam and 16 mains that makes it a bit launchier than the denser Gravities. This isn't one of those rackets where I can press on the gas and hit as loose as possible. You do need to focus on spinning the ball here to control it, and it has good spin, and using it well does produce a heavy ball, but I am more confident with the 1820s. Maybe if this was an 1819 or even a 1620, that would help, but I actually think the best solution would be a thinner beam. This just feels a little bit sloppier than the super clean feel you get on the Gravity Pro, so as much as I don't want to ask Head for more, I would love to try a 20mm Gravity Tour. I know that's never going to happen, but hey, it's worth a shot. But either way, this is a phenomenal racket. It's a super well-rounded 98 that's a real weapon in the right hands, but if it had been perfect, it would have been the easiest choice ever for me to put it in at number 1 as a certified Gravity fanboy, but I just couldn't do that. Moving on to number 2, and this is actually a racket when I first tested it, I liked but didn't love, but it has grown on me so much over the last 11 months or so, and if you watched that video from last week, you probably know what it is. It's the Yonex Ezone 98. So let's start with why I didn't instantly love it. Over the last several years, I have been a very vocal advocate for Yonex getting rid of vibration dampening mesh in the Ezone because I find it too mushy, and instead of getting rid of it, they basically doubled down on it. Not only does this racket still have VDM, but it's also softer than the previous one, and they added even more dampening with those Minilon bagworm fibers. And yes, this racket is still quite mushy and pretty dampened, but, and maybe this is some sort of Stockholm syndrome that I've developed by playing with it so much, but I kind of like this. All this new tech in here makes this racket significantly more user-friendly than older and more raw Ezone 98s, and not necessarily in a bad way. In fact, I think it's a net positive for playing better tennis. The accuracy isn't quite as high as on some previous Ezones because the sweet spot is so big, but the racket is just so much more forgiving on off-center hits that you don't have to be as perfect with it to still hit a good ball. And it's not like it's inaccurate. This is still an Ezone 98. It feels like home for those of us who love that combination of power and control that this racket line gives you. It's just a more modern take on that, and I've gotten really used to it at this point. I play some very good tennis with this racket, and that becomes even more clear to me when I test it alongside some other frames that I also like, and that's one of the biggest compliments I could give it. The other thing is that Yonex actually did change the shape a little bit with this new Ezone. Not drastically like they did with the V-Core 2 years ago, but enough to notice, and there are some serious benefits to that. They squared off the upper hoop, adding a bit more mass up here, which, like the teardrop head shape on the Gravity, does give you a little bit more plow through for power and spin. They did soften it up a little bit to rein in that extra power so it's not overbearing, and I think this does strike a really good balance of power, control, and also spin. I'm not going to get too into the spin, but it's an Ezone. It's very spin friendly. I'll probably never be in love with the feel here, but at this point, I'm kind of tired of criticizing it for that. It is what it is. And as long as you put a sharp, snappy, or crisp string in here, it's not too mushy to the point where you lose all your feel for the ball. So yeah, this is just the latest example of how Yonex takes a few more risks with their updates than most of the other brands in the industry, and they generally do a very good job. And it's also a great example of how Yonex aren't scared to ignore dumb YouTubers like me who think they know better and tell them to go in a different way, because this racket has been extremely popular, and it's in the final 4 of rackets I'm considering switching to. So I guess they do know better. But I'm not going to talk about it anymore, because by the end of next week, it'll have been in like 3 straight videos, and I'm going to run out of stuff to say. But great racket, great update, and a solid second place for Racket of the Year. But I couldn't put the Ezone number 1. In fact, this was probably the easiest choice for the number 1 spot over the last 3 years. The best racket of the year is the Tecnifibre T-Fight 305S. Now 1, this is a really, really good racket, and 2, this is probably the best example I can think of, maybe ever, in terms of how to update a racket to make it that much better. Tecnifibre did not shy away from major changes here. It's still very much a T-Fight, but they changed the balance, the swing weight, and most importantly, they changed the shape of the frame. That's what I call a major change. Basically, Tecnifibre had a sleeping giant with the older T-Fights. In terms of control-oriented 98s, they were probably the best at combining consistency with extremely high power potential and a lot of spin. I loved playing with them, and I still do, but they did have one critical flaw. They had super high swing weights and started to feel quite dated, with every other brand lowering their weight specs and speeding everything up. Well, Tecnifibre went on what I guess you could call a mission to make the T-Fight easier to swing, but also keep the amazing playability that T-Fight loyalists would have hated losing. So they did lower the swing weight and balance, but they also widened the beam so it kept its great power, and they made that beam a little bit boxier here in the hoop so that it didn't lose too much control. I probably don't need to say this because it's coming in at number 1, but this update works extremely well. It still plays and feels like a T-Fight, but it's so much quicker and more modern in general. This is just a phenomenal racket. Especially the feel is something that I was really worried about with a wider beam, but it's still just as pure, crisp, and connected to the ball as older T-Fights. And I just have to applaud Tecnifibre for what they did here. With such a radical change, they very well could have alienated longtime T-Fight loyalists in hopes of bringing new players to the line, but that's not what happened. This racket has been extremely well received, and if you still haven't tried it, but you're looking for a modern control racket that has good traditional feel, but enough power and spin to be competitive in the modern game, you really should give it a go. There's more variety here than on something like a Percept or a Blade. It's still a fairly advanced racket, but you can swing it faster, you can generate more easy spin. It's just a perfect improvement on what was already an incredible line. I knew Tecnifibre had this in them. This is a brand that does still fly under the radar a little bit, but if they can keep this innovation going, I do think they could be on a similar trajectory to the one Yonex was on in the 2010s. Develop an iconic racket, keep plugging away at your other lines, and you will eventually become competitive with the big 3. I also think maybe they could try a couple new paint jobs here and there. Not every racket has to be white, but that really isn't a big deal. That does wrap up this top 5 though. I know there are some big rackets that didn't make it, especially the New Speed Legend. I love it, but I don't think it quite cracks the top 5 this year, or at least I do need to spend more time with the standard version when that one comes out. With that said, that is going to be the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, if you want to demo any of the rackets I talked about here today, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.